So how can the FAA regulate the fact that air carriers have to have a very well-rounded and comprehensive manual system? Well, what they do is through a series of checks, they make sure that the air carrier actually has a manual system that allows them to operate. And what they do, if you intend to start an air carrier, once you have basically filed with your local FAA office, their Flight Standards District office, the intent to start an airline, the next step is really going to be to, once you know what your operation is going to be like, to write the manuals and make sure that those manuals address everything that the FAA requires you to address. Now the FAA, they issue what's called safety attribute inspections. What this is a huge database of thousands of questions that are designed to make the air carrier answer these questions in their manuals. This is part of the FAA's initiative that started years ago called One Level of Safety, in which they decided that all air carriers, because the traveling public does not really know the difference between, say, Delta Airlines, for example, and a smaller air carrier like Mesa Airlines, the public doesn't really know the difference, so they should have one level of safety for all these air carriers. And in doing this, the FAA came up with what's called safety attribute inspections. So these are thousands of questions that the airline must answer through its manuals systems. And often they just start at the different parts of 121 regulations and restate the regulations to say something like, does the air carrier show that operational control is shared between the dispatcher and the pilot in command? Well, if that's the question, then the air carrier has to answer that question somewhere in its manuals, and it usually has to provide a reference to the regulation that it's addressing. And it often also has to show that there is some sort of means to control whatever the regulation is, that it's actually being met. So, say for example, we were talking about a carry-on baggage program. The airline has to show in its manual that it will comply with regulations regarding keeping people's carry-on luggage stowed, so it doesn't fall down out of a bin and hurt somebody or fly out in an accident. Not only do they have to show that they're in their manual system how they are going to secure these bags, but they also have to show to the FAA that they have something like what's called a control to make sure that this actually happens. And that would probably be something like the flight attendants having a checklist that they use for making sure the cabin is secure before the aircraft is allowed to leave the gate. So that checklist, the flight attendants doing those checklists, that would be basically showing that they are in compliance with the regulation requiring the carry-on bags to be adequately stowed. So this is a big undertaking. I have worked in an air carrier that was starting, and it was extremely simple air carrier under supplemental rules with one airplane, and not complex operation at all. And it took us months and months to write our manuals and pass basically an inspection from the FAA of our manuals. Before the FAA spends any money on flying in your airplane or checking out your airplane at all, you have to prove to them that you have a good manual system. So what you end up having to do is answer these safety attribute inspection questions with references from your manuals that show where each thing is found in your manual, where you are in compliance with those questions. What some airlines do is pay a service. A company will come in and write the manuals for them. They basically ask questions about the operation and write the manuals accordingly. That's fine as long as the people who are running the airline actually understand their own manual system when it gets all to the end of the process. But what the FAA then does is they will choose, I believe it's 9 different safety attribute inspections and go through all those questions, sit down with the manuals in their office and make sure they're correct. And if they're correct, then it goes on to the next step, which is where the FAA checks all of the safety attribute inspections. There's a link here that you can go to and see basically what's involved. Most airlines, this process of manual writing takes months and goes through several different iterations where the FAA has to go back to them for changes and a lot of updates. A little bit more here on what's actually required on a manual page. There's some required things that are required. So we have the page number and the revision up here. And the revision date. And that's important. The revision number and date have to be on each page of the manual. Down here you can see this part of the manual has been approved by the FAA. It's been signed by probably the principal operations inspector at this air carrier's FSDO and dated. And then you can see here that various parts of this manual are not in revision 6. They are in revision 5. Some of these are even older revisions, 0, 2, or original. And then this apparently is revision 6. So this is an electronic version. You can see we have click here to access the whole manual. We could access the whole manual through this method, but don't need to do that. It's just an online version. But in print, then you'd have to take out each of these sections to actually revise the manual. So manuals are a really big deal in allowing the people working for the air carrier to do the best work and have the information handy. Nobody can memorize all the information, and the air carrier doesn't want you to as an employee. But you need to know where to access that information, where to find the information, so that you can remain in compliance with the manuals.